Hello and welcome to the Reasonably Good Life. I'm your host, Dr. Mike Brooks. This is a podcast and YouTube channel about using reason to pursue the good life in this complicated world. We are on episode 4, which is what is the root cause of the world's problems? So let's go to these 6 factors that I'm saying are some of the root causes of the world's problems. One is evolutionary mismatch. So this idea is that we did not evolve to live in the world in which we now live. If we look from an evolutionary time frame, and it depends where you start, Homo sapiens or our nearest relatives, if it's 200, 300,000 years, or you could even go back further, depending on what kind of timeline and criteria you're using. See, even that's complicated. But mostly, we evolved to live in nomadic hunter-gatherer tribes of about 100 to 150 people. So our minds, our bodies evolved to eat certain foods, to interact in certain ways. And now we live in a society that is very discrepant from that of our ancestors. Because of this discrepancy, it causes a lot of problems. Here's one example: the foods we eat. So we have an obesity epidemic in America. About 2/3 of Americans are overweight or obese. I'm going to throw a crazy stat at you. And I did this research for my book, Tech Generation, and I don't have the source handy, but I've verified it in other ways. If I can find it, I'll post it somewhere. But in 1990, there was not one state in the United States with over a 15% obesity rate. Okay. In 2016, there was not one state under 20% in their obesity rate. Oh my God, that is a crazy. In 26 years, we went from there. What happened? Again, very complicated, but we're eating a lot of foods, a lot, in quantities that we didn't evolve to eat, and high in salt, sugar, fat, processed foods that we are drawn to. We are naturally drawn to salt, sugar, and fat because historically, from an evolutionary sense, those were good energy sources, right? A fruit tree, an apple tree. Well, we could only eat so many apples at once before we'd feel ill. And also they were seasonal, right? But now we have candy and ice cream and cookies and potato chips and all these things that we're drawn to because they are exaggerated versions of things that were in our environments that were good for us. But now we have these exaggerated versions. These are called supernormal stimuli. And I did another podcast, actually a YouTube episode on that some time back. But supernormal stimuli are exaggerated versions of things we're naturally drawn to, and it kind of hijacks our brain. So that's why when we look at, well, why do we eat a bunch of potato chips and French fries when they're not healthy for us, right? Why are we drawn to them if they're so bad for us? Well, they're exaggerated versions of things that evolutionarily we did not have easy access to a lot of food, and in the quantities and in the exaggerated flavors that we have now. So it's easy to overdo it, and thus we have an obesity epidemic. Now, there's more reasons than that, and social and cultural, but that's one reason. You think of technology, another evolutionary mismatch is historically all of our communication was pretty much within our tribe of 100 to 150 people. So now we have things like social media, where we have thousands or millions of followers, people we've never met, and we're posting things and, saying things that we wouldn't say to someone in person. And this is a very unusual way to interact with other people that's very discrepant from our evolutionary heritage. So it causes problems. That's evolutionary mismatch. And a lot of other societal problems are evolutionary mismatch. And I'm going to string some of these other factors together, but you look at, we didn't evolve to think in ways to solve some of these big societal problems that we face now, like climate change. Our ancestors didn't have to think about climate change. Or politics, federal government versus state government versus local government. And, we have with COVID and mass restrictions and what should we have the liberty to do and what can the government tell us? Well, our brains, we're not evolved to think in those complexities. Saving for retirement makes no evolutionary sense. Taxation rates, healthcare, transgender rights. I mean, again, these societal problems make no sense from an evolutionary standpoint. Our ancestors did not have to deal with these types of problems in order to survive. So now we're stuck in this society that is orders of magnitude more complicated than that of our evolutionary ancestors. And because there's this gap, this mismatch, it causes problems. As our ancient brain try to figure out how to navigate these problems. Even the tribalism that we fall into, these political tribes of left and right are in a way tied to our evolutionary history of, wanting to be in a tribe. But now it's, we're voting for people for office and, for president and things like that. And these tribes aren't 100 to 150 people, they're millions of people. And again, we can't deal with that well, and it causes problems in our society. Now, this is related, factor two is related to evolutionary mismatch, and it's called tragedy of the commons. And this is when individual users who have open access to a resource unhampered by shared social structures or formal rules that govern access and use act independently according to their own self-interest and contrary to the common good of all users, cause depletion of the resource through their uncoordinated action. Whew, okay, I didn't make up that definition myself. Admittedly, I got it from Wikipedia. But that is to say, when we act as individuals, a lot of things aren't problematic, but collectively, us acting in our own self-interest causes problems on a societal level, like depletion of resources, like global climate change. As we drive our kids to soccer and drive to work, and we're putting out a little exhaust in our car or whatever, it's like, well, it's not that big a deal, it's just one person or whatever. Or when we buy plastic stuff in plastic casings and stuff like that, it's like, well, we're just one individual. And, we need this thing. We need this salad bag or, the shell, the plastic shell with all the chopped up salad. It's very convenient, right? But then we have the plastic. Well, the aggregate effect of millions and millions of people doing that every day causes societal problems. That's why we have the Great Pacific garbage patch that's bigger than, was it like Russia or something? It's just ginormous because this aggregate effect. So eating meat is another one where we have to, mow down forests and create grazing land. And it's like, well, that's not inherently bad, but the aggregate effect of when we have almost 8 billion people on the earth, it causes problems. So that is the tragedy of the commons. I love that name too. It's just very catchy.
Now a quick word about the Reasonably Good Life sponsor, Pinwheel. Pinwheel is a phone designed to be a smarter phone for kids and teens. It's a tool and not a toy. It has the most useful features of smartphones without all of the trappings that concern parents. I've served as a consultant for the development of Pinwheel, and my 10-year-old has one and loves it, and my wife and I love it too. If you go to pinwheel.com and order a phone, you can get a 10% discount by using this code, Brooks10. That's spelled out T-E-N, and it's all one word, Brooks10. Now, back to the Reasonably Good Life.
Factor 3, we're on factor 3 here, hedonic adaptation. So that's also called the hedonic treadmill. And as researchers started to study happiness, they noticed this thing is that we are very adaptive creatures, right? We've established that. That's how we got here to begin with. We're adaptive. Well, we're adaptive, and this means when something good happens or bad happens, it's like we have this set point that we gravitate back toward after a short period of time. So if we, find money or win the lottery or, lose a job or something like that, wreck our car, granted that we don't have serious long-lasting injuries, but things like that, yes, they suck. Yes, they can be inconvenient, or they can be really nice, good things happen. Regardless of those good or bad things, we tend to gravitate back toward our set point after a relatively short amount of time. Now, it needs to be this way because we wouldn't survive without hedonic adaptation, because pleasure and pain, we need to adapt to those because those serve a purpose to move us toward things that are good for us and away from things that are bad for us. Imagine that the really good ice cream cone that we tasted, the good feelings stayed with us forever. Well, we wouldn't know what to eat, because every time we eat food, we'd still be tasting the good ice cream cone. Like, we have to get that out of our system. So the next food we eat, and we're like, oh, this milk is spoiled or whatever, we need to be able to do that. In order to do that, we have to adjust and back to our set point so that we can start from scratch to notice whether things are good for us or bad for us. So I've mentioned this in other ones, like wearing a mask. It's funny how that was really inconvenient at first, but after a while, I didn't really notice it. In fact, after a while, it felt weird not to wear a mask. Now I'm having to adjust to not wearing a mask, which should happen relatively quickly, but it's still kind of messing with my head a little bit. But, over time, we'll get it, and you will too. But that's just a version of hedonic adaptation. Now, it has its limits. If something really, really horrible happens to us, like death of a loved one, it can really affect us for a long time. And for you who've experienced those things, my heart goes out to you. I've lost both my parents, sadly, and I know that affected me for quite some time. And there's absolute horror stories out there. I don't want to sweep those under the rug. So if you've experienced those, my heart goes out to you, and life can really suck sometimes. But as we know, for the day-to-day things, we tend to adjust fairly quickly. And even some bigger ones, if we move into a new house or get a new car, that's one I'll be so happy when I get this car, and I'll treat it just perfect, and I'll always vacuum it, and I'll treat it like, oh my God, it'll be the greatest thing ever. And, at first it's like, yay, my new car. After a while, it just seems like our car. It's no big deal. Another factor, we'll go to factor 4 now. It's called prevalence induced concept change. Now that's a mouthful. I ran across this in a recent article, and it's by a string of psychologists, one of whom is Dr. Dan Gilbert. He's a social psychologist at Harvard. He was my undergraduate social psychology professor at the University of Texas. So I'm especially enamored by this idea. Dr. Gilbert wrote Stumbling on Happiness, a great book too, if you want to read a great book about happiness. But let's go back to prevalence-induced concept change. What does that mean, that mouthful? So we think a problem persists even when it becomes less frequent. So what happens is, because we're adaptive, right? We've established that the hedonic adaptation, we're so adaptive that when we see a stimulus, and they've done studies on this, like let's say we're separating colors. We're told to pick out the blue dots and separate those and count them distinguish them from red and yellow, green, and purple dots, right? Okay, so we're looking at the dots, we see how many blue ones there are, and imagine that the researcher gradually starts to reduce the number of blue dots, right? And they'll even tell the participants, we're reducing the blue dots, and do not count the purple dots as blue dots, okay? Do not do that. Well, what they found is even when they told the participants in the study to not count the purple dots as blue dots, as the researcher removed blue dots from the field and kept having the participants look at the dots again, the participants would start counting the purple dots as blue dots. They did this with a number of different things, including faces of like which are angry faces or unhappy faces, and distinguish those from normal faces or happy faces. And again, what happens is you readjust to start to see the stimulus or the signal even when it becomes less frequent. So how does this make sense? Let me make a real world example, okay? And I don't want to get any hot water on this, so just hear me out. Racism and sexism, do they exist? Yes. Are they prevalent? Fairly prevalent. Some cultures more than others, right? Some areas of the country more than others. Again, it's complicated. Now, has it gotten better over time? If we take racism, yes, racism exists. Yes, it's a problem. And yes, people suffer from it. Now, the question I'd ask is, was it worse 50 years ago in America? Was it worse 100 years ago, right? Well, even as things get better, our radar is up. We're looking for it, and we can find instances of racism all around. We see them in the news all the time, right? However, if we were to go back 100 years or 200 years ago, the racism in America was way worse. So things have gotten better, and there's still a lot of room for improvement. That's non-dualism. I talked about that in my last episode. But that's an example of prevalence-induced concept change. So that's why, one of the reasons why we keep thinking the world sucks even when things get better, because we adjust to things getting better and it still looks like the world sucks. I hope that makes some sense. But that's one of the things that's going on. And one of the roots of the problem is we keep seeing problems persist or get worse even as many things get better. And this relates to factor 5, a negativity bias. We inherently, as human creatures, are more drawn to the negative over the positive. There's many, many studies that document this, the power of bad. You can look it up. But losing hurts more than winning. So like if we lost $100, we're bothered more by that than if we had won $100. In general, yes, there are exceptions, but in general, losses hurt more than the good feeling on the flip side. So losing a championship narrowly can be more painful and stick with us more than narrowly winning the championship. There's more negative words in the English vocabulary for feeling states, more negative feeling states than there are words for positive feeling states. Another example of a negativity bias is contamination. Imagine a roach dropped in your glass of apple juice, or let's say a beer. Okay, you wouldn't want to drink it, right? Although when I get a black fly in my wine, I usually fish it out. I don't know about you. There's a bunch of them. I toss it. But anyway, so contamination. Imagine a roach drops into your beer or apple juice. Would you drink it? No. Now, imagine someone were to say, well, okay, it was a glass. What if it were a huge vat, a beer, a barrel of beer, a keg of beer, and there was a roach? Would you drink it? Let's say we fished the roach out, but you knew it was in there. Would you drink it? It doesn't take much of a negative thing to contaminate our food. Like if you find a hair in your food, so gross, right? Well, one hair it could be a big meal, but that one hair can spoil the whole meal. So this is why this negativity bias, why do we have it, right? Because evolutionarily, we needed to be more focused on the negative than the positive. So what do I mean by this? So imagine our ancestors, 50,000 years ago, if they didn't hear that there was a pride of lions at the watering hole, okay, they didn't pay attention to the negative news that there's a pride of lions at the watering hole, they could be dead, right? That could be it. One mistake, you're gone. Now, the positive news is there's an apple tree over there. And what if they miss that positive news? Well, they would likely still live another day, right? But missing the negative news, it could just be one time you're dead. So we're naturally inclined to pay more attention to the negative over the positive because it has a greater survival value. That's why with the news, if it bleeds, it leads. We are more drawn to the negative news stories over the positive. Negative partisanship in our politics. We tend to vote more against the other schmuck because we hate them more than we're voting for our candidate because we love them so much. We fear, we hate the other person. And so we vote for our person. And that's that negativity bias, the constant stream of negative news, doom scrolling, right? We even have a name for it now because we are drawn, those negative news stories, the ones about outrage and crazy things, bad things happening, they get more clicks, they get more shares, they get more likes when people tweet, outrage trends on social media. And so this negativity bias is with us, and it causes us to look at all the negatives of the world, and there are plenty, right? And it makes us feel like the world is going down the tubes. And even when things are getting better, it's hard for us to take that in because there's no shortage of negative news in the world, and we keep being drawn to it. And because we're drawn to it, the news media keeps feeding it to us, and it makes them money. Trump, love him or hate him, I think it made a lot of money for the news because the statements he'd make, it got a lot of eyeballs clicking and sharing things for good or for ill. And it made the news media a lot of money. Okay, so factor 6 is the last one I'm going to talk about. It's dualism. Now, I talked some about that in the last episode. I hope you join me for that. So the 6 factors of the root of the world's problems, we're on the 6th, is dualism, is that we have, because of this evolutionary mismatch, right? We evolved to live in these hunter-gatherer tribes. We have a lot of biases. We have a lot of filters and cognitive shortcuts we use to make sense of the world because there's so much information coming in. If we didn't have these shortcuts, we'd be overwhelmed. We'd be paralyzed. We'd be like a deer in the headlights. So these biases, they're not inherently bad. We need them. But because we live in this really complicated world, all these biases can cause some problems. And one of the things they can do is get us into a black or white thinking about the world. This is the dualism. It's 2 poles, left or right, good or bad, right or wrong, nature, nurture, male, female, all these kind of dualistic. We want to simplify complexity by putting things into us versus them, good guys versus bad guys. It's funny because left or right, the other side, if you're liberal, you're looking at the conservatives thinking, God, those people are so wacky and why they follow Trump and they believe this and that, and they're so wrong and they're trying to screw up America. On the other side, conservatives, Republicans are looking at liberals and basically thinking the same things about them. You're screwing up America. You're going to ruin this country. You have bad leadership. You're going to make us go bankrupt. The economy is going to go down the tubes, which in a way makes these poles more alike than different. But anyway, looking at the other side is you're the enemy and we're the good guys is a form of dualism. This tribalism, us versus them, is not how the world works, because the world is very complicated and full of nuance, yet we are being drawn into these very constrained ways of thinking because we're taking these shortcuts in our thinking because of this evolutionary mismatch, and we get overwhelmed easily. But this causes a lot of problems as you look in our politics of this right versus left, liberal versus conservative. We can't get anything done in this government because it's this winner take all, and I'd rather, go down with the ship than let you win. It's just madness. Anyway, I think that gets us into a lot of trouble, this dualism, and that's factor 6 in the roots of the world's problems. So I'm going to try to tie these together in some way. So I hope this makes some sense. And that, again, you don't have to completely agree with everything I'm saying here. You can, partially agree. That's fine. And that's being flexible, right? You don't don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. It doesn't have to be all or none. Anything I'm saying, feel free to disagree. You have many ideas that are great on your own, and I probably will hear from some of you and say, oh, you forgot this, or this is a big one, and you're probably right. And I'll be like, oh, I can't believe I forgot to say that. Anyway, I'm going to try to tie these 6 factors together a little bit, or summarize. So we live in a world that's very complicated and very discrepant from our evolutionary heritage. So our brains are pre-wired to survive and thrive in an environment that is very different from the world in which we now live. We're incredibly adaptive. So even though humans have made a lot of progress over, the last several thousand years, like starvation, famine, used to be 200 years ago, 80% of the world lived in extreme poverty. Now, less than 9% do. That's amazing progress. But because we're so adaptive, because of prevalence-induced concept change, things keep seeming really crappy even when they get better. And because we're drawn to the negative news over the positive news, and the media is happy to provide it because that's how they make money. If they didn't provide it, they'd probably go out of business. So they provide it. They're competing with each other for our ears and eyeballs. So they pump us with negative news. We're drawn to it. We think the world's going to hell in a handbasket. We're overwhelmed by the negative news. We separate into our tribes of, liberal, conservative, us versus them. We hate the other side. This polarization is the dualism, which causes so much problem. I think is causing so many problems in our society today. We're far from United States in these United States. And then once we're in our tribes, and I'm going to follow up on another episode on this, once we are in our tribes and we identify with a particular tribe, what happens is this confirmation bias is we're motivated to perceive the world and to take in information in a way that keeps our tribal allegiance intact. So that's a confirmation bias or an in-group bias where we keep filtering and culling through information in a way that supports what we already believe and keeps our tribal cohesion. Now, this goes against what I'm advocating is to get past, to work, and we'll never get past them, but like to work through these problems more effectively. I think we need to be more flexible than ever because the world's more complicated than it's ever been. We need to level up our flexibility game. Otherwise, we will suffer the consequences. So I'm going to be following up on some of these ideas in future episodes. And one of these that'll be an extension of this is why the world feels like it's getting worse when it's not. And I'm going to document some of these things and show some statistics. Thanks, everybody. This has been The Reasonably Good Life with Dr. Mike Brooks. Be curious, be flexible, be kind, and for goodness sakes, be reasonable. Thanks again for joining me today, and I hope that you join me for my next episode. Take care.
Hey, thanks again for joining me today. I want to give a special shout out to Eric Kenow and Patrick Kennedy for their help with both the podcast and YouTube versions of The Reasonably Good Life. If you enjoyed this episode, I always appreciate follows, likes, and shares. Also, if you want to follow me, my website is www.drmikebrooks.com. For Instagram and Twitter, I am at Dr. Mike Brooks. For Facebook, it's Dr. Mike Brooks The Reasonably Good Life. And for email, you can contact me at contact@reasonablygoodlife.com. Thanks again, and I hope to see you next time.